Hi everyone, welcome to an episode that's not normally done on our page here at Simulated Air Tanker Operations. I'm going to be doing one of the first videos, hopefully of many more, of a actual purpose-built model for firefighting in Microsoft Flights, or I was going to say in Flight Simulator, and for FSX and for P3D. So the Virtavia Neptune, which is here in front of me, has been around for several years. Back in, I want to say the model first came out in either, I don't think it was out in FS 2002, but in FS 2004, I believe it was. But back then, Virtavia was actually Alpha Sim, and the only versions they had were the Navy variants with the ray dome on the bottom and the long stinger tail. It wasn't until I believe it was last year in 2020 they released the remastered package of the P2 Neptunes for both FSX and P3D. And in that remastered package, they not only made it compatible for P3D version 4, but they also added two firefighting models to the lineup. Now, this video is going to be kind of hard on Virtavia, but people like me, and I'm sure there's several others out there that are super um, detail oriented when it comes to aircraft that they like, and in particular in aerial firefighting aircraft, since this is really one of the only purpose-built firefighting aircraft we have that's payware out there that's available to people. It's kind of it's unique in its own way, but it also has a lot of issues. I'll just put that right out there. There's quite a few issues, so I'm kind of using this as a review and also kind of springboarding off into a development project that I'm currently working on with some of our beta testers and stuff like that for improving this aircraft so it's a little bit more realistic towards the real aircraft. I'll just leave that for later on discussion in the video. This video might run a little bit long because I'm kind of doing two parts of this. The first part being the initial review, and then the second part will be what I'm planning on doing to basically upgrade these. As you know, if you follow our group at all, that's kind of what we do. We kind of take aircraft that have already been around for a bit, and we just make them a little bit better. Um, so, in terms of these, the Neptune recently was retired from active duty service in the aerial firefighting industry. Neptune Aviation was the last operator of the P2 Neptune, and the two versions that Virtavia included in their remastered package is the P2V7, which, as you see in front of me here, is that model. Now, both the models that they included are both the P2H or P2V5 or P2V7 models, and they're indicative of that because of the bubble style cockpit. You can see that the cockpit glass is bubble shaped. The other well-known version is the P2V5, which actually is a enclosed, more traditional, I guess you would say, bomber style canopy where it's just straight across the top here. It's a minor difference, but the two versions that they included are basically nearly identical models. The only difference being is this front glass window here is covered on the second model. That's really the only difference in these two models that as they've come to us. Other than that, that's really the only cosmetic differences in these two versions. Both the aircraft that they did decide to provide for this package, or in addition to the Navy versions, were both from Minden Air. Minden was one of the only other operators of the Neptune for a while, other than Neptune, and their aircraft had a series of problems late in the season, and they initially had three aircraft. One was sadly lost, a fatal accident that happened several years prior, and then they lost this aircraft you see in front of me had a hydraulics failure. I believe it made an emergency landing in Minden, Nevada. Um, they had a stuck gear and they made a successful emergency landing. The crew walked away from that, all right, and then their second aircraft, Tanker 48, which people may not recognize, but it's a all white airplane with yellow, um, and that aircraft had a similar hydraulics problem. It had a nose gear collapse on landing in California, and that pretty much ended Minden's operation of the Neptune. But anyway, getting back towards the actual these models themselves. Now, Virtavia, they call this a remastered package. Um, I wouldn't necessarily say they've been remastered to a whole degree. Um, the only remastered part I guess you can say is that they made them compatible for P3D version 4, which this one here is. But to my knowledge, these lack PBR um, for version 4 because they have separate versions for FSX and P3D. But to my knowledge, uh, these don't have PBR. I may be wrong. Somebody may correct me if they see this video, but I don't believe these have PBR. So that's kind of a downfall for these. So when I think of remastered, I kind of think that they've been fine-tuned for the sim that they're available in, and it doesn't seem that they are. And from judging from what I've talked to people in FSX that have this aircraft, um, it's basically the same aircraft in FSX. And so it also leads me back to whenever this aircraft is available under AlphaSim, the interior is nearly identical to that as well. So essentially what they've done is taken the old FS 2004 model and just maybe tweaked a few things and changed the display sizes or some of the textures, and that's basically it. The model, the interior model, and most of the textures haven't changed from FS 2004. Now, is that surprising? Not necessarily, because there are other companies out there that have done the same thing. They've just simply revamped, not even revamped, they've just basically hauled their aircraft from one sim to the next, just making it compatible and not really changing a whole lot else. We see that with Captain Sim and their C-130, which, don't get me wrong, fantastic model and it's aged very, very well, but the interior is very, very dated, and we don't even have the modern style cockpits in any of the C-130s, at least to my knowledge. Even in version 5 of P3D, they still don't have the modernized cockpits in any of the aircraft, which is, a little sad. But anyway, getting back to these, the the model itself, I mean, it looks okay when you get up close to it, but you can see the panel lines are really, really faded. They don't really stand out very much, which also leads me to the fact that this is why it probably doesn't. It leads me to think that it doesn't have PBR. Because in P3D, if an aircraft has PBR, generally speaking, any type of panel lines or anything like that on the aircraft will stand out. Now, that also brings you to the next point about these models, is that they have no surface detail whatsoever, or very little surface detail. So essentially, the entire skin of the aircraft, instead of having small rivets and panel lines modeled into the aircraft, these have none of that. It's essentially just a flat, featureless aircraft on the outside. All of the detail is in the textures, which is an older style of dealing with the exterior appearance of aircraft. Which, don't get me wrong, it still is okay looking, judging by how you see it here, but it really could be done better, in my opinion. Like I said, whenever I think of it being remastered, that's kind of what I think should have been done. Like I said, I keep going back that I'm grateful that we have an actual firefighting version of the P2 around, because the only other one I think was way back from FS 2002 version, from what I remember flying in very early, in my very early FS9 days. But these, like I said, there's very little surface detail, which is again kind of a letdown. Um, and you know, as far as anything else with the aircraft, I mean, it's functional. The other downfalls, I mean, unfortunately, there's several downfalls of this. I mean, we're just talking about the exterior model right now, but like I said, it looks halfway decent. I will give Virtavia that. It looks okay. It looks pretty good. But like I said, when you get up close to it, you're like, it still needs maybe a little bit of work. And granted, these weren't very expensive in comparison to some of the other payware aircraft that are out there. I believe this was $20 whenever I bought it. So, and you know, there's we'll get into a little bit more of the kind of some of these. I wouldn't say quirks, but things that were basically left out of it. And I don't really want to try and drag Virtavia slash AlphaSim through the mud here, but it's kind of sound like I am whenever you get around to it. So we did get these firefighting models in addition to the Navy ones, and you know, there's several versions of that out there, different liveries and whatnot else. But with these, when we get to the flight model themselves, the flight model is absolutely atrocious. The P-2 Neptune is a fairly large airplane, and 4 engines. You see here, it's a hybrid essentially. They uses you know, it has 2 large piston engines and 2 jet engines. It's kind of an indicative operation back in the 1950s that if an aircraft didn't have enough power, they simply threw these turbojet engines onto them. We see that with a lot of not necessarily just the patrol aircraft like the P-2 here, but we saw that with a lot of the Air Force bombers back in the day, like the you know, like the Peacemaker and things like that, where they just, or you know, some of the refuelers too, even they just slapped a couple of turbojet engines onto them to add extra power. Um, but you know, anyway, getting back to the flight model, the flight model is absolutely terrible. There is definitely corners cut on this entire model, unfortunately, and that's one of these areas where they just kind of threw a generic, I feel like, flight dynamic model at this airplane, which, you know, did it a complete disservice, I think, because like I said, the P-2 is a, you know, a large airplane, and essentially the way that they have this thing flying, it flies like a glorified Cessna, essentially. Um, Now, I don't remember any reference speeds offhand for the real aircraft or this one in the sim, but I remember that they are seriously unrealistic. I mean, we're coming in for a landing with full flaps, as they do, and we're talking this thing's landing at like 90 knots, which is nowhere near what they land. They don't fly that slow, and it just, the flight dynamics are just so floaty and unrealistic. It's like you're flying, like I said, a light Cessna as opposed to a heavy, basically 4 engine airplane. Um, you know, we're getting back into the more in-depth part of the flight dynamics. This aircraft also lacks a payload station in the aircraft CFG file. That is a little annoying to me. Granted, not many people probably simulate carrying ordnance, or in this case, carrying fire retardant. But for those of us that use programs, external utilities like Firefighter X, the fact that there's no payload station makes it a little bit difficult to actually add retardant for that utility. I mean, it'll do it, but this aircraft essentially has no other. It doesn't have one added in the CFG file, which, like I said, is annoying. So you can't even if you didn't say want to run Firefighter X, you can just fly around and do training with a simulated load of retardant on board. You can't even do that. So that's another thing that they just kind of overlooked. One other large thing that they overlooked is the fact that the Neptune is 4 engines, not 2, it's 4. So I mean, I know you can't model an aircraft having both piston engines and jet engines, but there are ways around it to make it have 4 engine like performance. in the CFG file. You just have to spend some time, basically, you have to spend time doing that so that it acts like a four-engine airplane, which it is. Now, in real life, the Neptunes, at least the firefighting versions, I can't say how they were used in the Navy, but I'm sure it was something probably very similar. But essentially, the jet engines are usually only used in three modes of flight. Usually in takeoff, near landing, or in the case of firefighting aircraft, when they're in the process of coming in for a drop. So that extra boost in power helps them, get out of potentially tight terrain and things like that. They have more power on tap once they've released their retardant loads. So that's basically how they're used. But again, in the stock version, they're only coded for two engines. So that also makes it so that the airplane is super underpowered for the weight that it is. And that gets me to the other point, is that all the weights and balances that are for this airplane are also not accurate, even to the Navy versions, which they're all based off the same CFG file, the Navy versions and the firefighting versions, which again, they should have probably been separate because the firefighting versions are different configurations than the Navy aircraft. The firefighting versions are obviously lighter because they don't have most of the Navy electronics in them anymore. So they're lighter, most of them are. But, that's just some of the things that I'm just kind of like, you maybe should have spent a little bit more time. I mean, I can kind of understand some of these companies may not have maybe the resources to get that in depth with maybe development of some of these aircraft, but I mean, just a little bit of research would have been, helpful, and maybe separating the models so that they're different than the Navy versions. But it kind of just feels like they just took the firefighting versions and just kind of said, oh, well, we've already got these Navy ones, and just kind of attached everything that they already had and just kind of threw them out there with them. And that, like I said, it kind of I think degrades the overall quality of the product whenever they did that. The other thing that was severely lacking were the sounds. The sounds are absolutely atrocious as well. They just took like a generic off-the-shelf piston engine airplane from their design studio and probably just threw it in this airplane. And that's literally what it sounds like. It just sounds like a generic propeller-driven airplane. And anybody who's ever heard a P-2 Neptune in person knows that it has a very, very unique sound to it because of the jet engines. And the fact of the other matter is that the two piston engines that it has is the Wright R3350, and they're a turbo radial compound engine, which is the same that's used on the DC-7. That's a very powerful engine. So you combine that very throaty radial engine noise with those turbojet engines, and it makes a very, very specific noise. And no other aircraft out there really sounds like a P-2 as a result of that. So, again, somewhere where I think some of the main emphasis on what makes a P-2 were overlooked in that sense, because maybe you can get around the flight dynamics, but the sounds are kind of like one of those things that make the P-2 iconic, at least in my opinion. So I applaud Virtavia for bringing us. This is literally one of the only aircraft out there that's purpose-built, modeled for flight simulators to be a firebombing airplane. You've got other ones that are just adaptions or whatnot else. Especially ones that our group themselves we've put out. But I mean, this is the first one that I can think of that, like I said, it was designed specifically to represent a physical air tanker version of the airplane. The only other one out there that I know of is obviously the CL-415 or 215. And then before that, there's a DC-4 tanker that's out there too. That was out there too for a long time. It was by JBK, the JBK DC-4. It had the Buffalo Airways livery. I did several repaints for that recently, actually. Last year, I think it was. But that's one thing that I will give Virtavia here, is that I am extremely grateful that this particular era of this aircraft's history is being represented by these payware companies, because the Neptune flew longer as an air tanker than it did as a patrol bomber in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, and even foreign navies, because there's several other foreign navies that use them as patrol and anti-submarine aircraft. They served longer as air tankers than they did anything else, and it seems like so many of these old radial engined air tankers that once they've left service, they're either taken by these either flying aviation museums or museums in general, and their entire life as a tanker is completely erased, and they're changed back into their wartime liveries, which they spent less time as in comparison to as they are in these air tanker configurations. Um, so that I will give Virtavia. I'm very grateful that they did take the time to at least give us these two very similar versions of the P2 in the Firebomber configurations. Um, like I said, there's several versions of the P2 Neptune. There's this, as I said, there's a the P2V5, the different canopy, and then there's the SP2H or P2H that was dejetted by Aero Union. Aero Union had several that they operated for a number of years that had the jet engines removed. They were very slick. They essentially had the same livery as their P3 Orions, but they were interesting because they had computerized constant flow tanks, whereas the P2Vs had electronically controlled doors, individual doors. If you ever look at the bottom of a P2 Neptune, they use a door system. They don't use a constant flow tank with a the constant flow tanks. They have a pneumatic computer controlled door that changes the coverage levels in the belly of the airplane. And the SP2Hs, the Aero Union flew, were some of the first airplanes with those style tanks. You see them used a lot nowadays in other aircraft like Colson C-130s. The P-3 Orions have that same tank in them, I believe. Airspray uses them in their Electras, but they're the same tanks designed by Aero Union on the Electras, to my knowledge. And then they're also used on Cal Fire's S2Ts. But yeah, so those particular Neptunes that Aero Union used are very unique because of that configuration. The airframe was very slick and very efficient, despite not having the jet engines, and it didn't carry as much as the P2Vs. It could actually fly faster and was more efficient getting to and from fires than the jet versions were because they were lighter, and like I said, more slick. As a result, because with the external or with the tanks on the P2Vs like these here, they stick down along the airframe, so it does add some air resistance. While the Aero Union, they call them fire stars, it was actually sucked up into where the bomb bay would be, so it didn't affect any of the airflow of the airplane. And like I said, without the jet engines, the extra drag on the wings of not having the jet engines on them made them slick. So, unfortunately, those versions aren't represented here. It's just two basically same airframes. Very minor. I mean, I shouldn't even say minor. They're basically the same airframe that are in this package. So, that kind of brings me to the things that we're working on to change to enhance the P2s. Now, unlike some of the other conversion projects and things like that we've done, that's not what I'm doing with these. With these, it's major coding changes, and of course, I'm adding new liveries to go along with them. Some liveries are kind of a fictional representation of the other airframes. Since these are the only firefighting versions we have, I've taken the other liveries that were on other P2 versions and put them onto these. Just to add, it's simple for variation's sake, as I know that I like making a lot of variations of these aircraft simply because I'm likely the only one that's doing repaints for some of them. So that's one thing that I'm doing with them is I'm adding a ton of repaints. I will all those things that I went over in the kind of shortcomings of this video in terms of the flight dynamics. I am changing. I'm doing a complete revamp of the flight dynamics all the way down to the air files. So I'm creating. I have an air file in testing currently in our beta team. They're testing it along with the aircraft configuration files to turn this into true four-engine airplane, um, and as well as I'm updating the sounds. I'm adding a payload station for use in Firefighter X, or if anybody wants to just fly around and use it for the Navy versions, they can do that too. But I'm focusing on firefighting aircraft, obviously, but I'm also adding a few other sound enhancements and visual enhancements for these. So, like, I'm adding smoke for the jet engines, and some other sound-related things like squeaking brakes and things like that, because the Neptunes are known for having squeaky brakes. Um, and that's kind of where we're going with this. Is that I wanted to make this better. I'm not messing with the visuals or anything like that. I'm not messing with the models or anything else like that. It's simply a bunch of coding changes and additions to essentially enhance where I think this airplane should be to do it justice for what type of airplane it is. Like I said, in particular, the sounds and the flight dynamics in particular are just two big things that I felt really undercut this being a halfway decent aircraft to own for people to fly around. And like I said, those of us that have been around the P2s and firefighting and stuff like that, been at the bases and seen them reloading and taking off and, dropping on fires and whatnot else, the part of that wanting to fly them into simulators because of how they sound and all the things they've seen them do. And, whenever you get something to try and simulate, hence simulations, what you've seen in real life, and it kind of does you know, it, in a pretty lackluster fashion or not at all. It kind of takes the wind out of your sails, in my opinion. Takes the fun out of owning that particular airplane in your simulator. If it maybe doesn't sound, it sounds terrible and it flies terrible. It's like two big things to me in a simulator that, it makes it enjoyable. The immersion is that, yeah, I've seen a plane do this, and then when you get in there and fly it, you're like, oh yeah, this thing feels heavy. When you're flying it around, and you're plugging in the power, and you can hear the jets, kick in whenever you're climbing out of a drop or something like that. Stuff like that is what I think brings to, like I said, the immersion and the overall enjoyment of the simulator, or the aircraft in the simulator. So, with those changes that I'm working on, the good thing is that you don't have to worry about, at least as far as I'm aware of yet, you don't have to worry about cross-platform compatibility. Essentially, what I'm saying is that I believe that all of these modifications that I'm working on currently will be compatible with FSX, the FSX versions of these, as it will be the P3D version 4 versions. So, like I said, I've got a few people that are already in our beta team testing it, the early flight dynamics changes in both simulators, and so far there haven't been any reported issues, so that's good. So, the project is underway, and we're pretty far into it already. Um, since this aircraft, I've had these tweaks working as far back as early FSX days when it was still the Alpha Sim P2. It kind of made updating it to work with these fairly similar because it's the same exact airplane. Um, it just added, like I said, the firefighting versions. So most of the work has already been done. Now it's just kind of taking a fine-tooth comb through it and having other people test it and see, maybe this needs to get tweaked a little bit more, or is there anything we can do about this particular issue or whatnot else? We're just taking it and we're enhancing it is all we're doing. So that's kind of where we are with the Virtavia Neptune. So I would say if anybody sees this airplane for sale in any of the marketplaces, I would still recommend you buy it simply because this is one of the only purpose-built air tanker versions you can get out there. That's not, like I said, a scooper platform, because I believe Virtavia also has the Martin Mars, and then obviously there's several other freeware, you know, scooping platforms I believe that are out there aside from the air tanker versions that we've converted. This is the first payware, and to my knowledge, the only payware airplane that's an air tanker. Um, so yeah, I would still recommend this, even though there are a lot of shortcomings with the model that we're obviously, as a group, we're trying to work out and, like I said, make it better. But in lieu of that, I still would say to buy it simply because of those facts. And we're trying to make it compatible with uh, with Firefighter X so that we can use it with that utility and all that. Um, but yeah, and the like I said, I don't want to like make this a huge video of dragging Virtavia through the mud uh, in this, but visually the model is, on a scale of 1 to 5, it's probably a 3. It's right in the middle, 3.5, right in the middle. And it would be better. It would be higher up if they spent more time on the physical model exterior itself. Be a 5 out of 5 if they, like I said, they had the matching flight dynamics. The sounds I could probably get over them not being realistic, because it's hard to find sounds of them flying around to make a decent sound set. So luckily I've been around them a lot, so that's one thing that I'm working on with them. But like I said, for me it's a 3.5 out of 4 or 3.5 out of 5 stars if I were to rate this for people to buy. So it's right in the middle. Like I said, I think the way that it sits, is it worth the money? I mean, it's debatable, but I mean, somebody did spend the time to make these models, so that's worth something. So, I would definitely support anybody buying these models, or just the whole package, to get these, or even the Navy versions if you want to fly the Navy versions. Have right at it, because they all fly the same. It's the same model, same flight model. But that's the Virtavia Neptune, and also the segue into the our attempt at upgrading it to be more realistic as well. So thanks for tuning into this, and hopefully we'll be getting some more stuff out here pretty soon, and starting the branch over into Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 as well is coming on the way. So thanks a lot for the support with the past projects, and let's hope we can get some of these other payware companies to make more of these tankers for us to use in P3D, FSX, or even the new sims. So we'll hopefully that keeps on going. So thanks again, and tune into the next one.